Hello and good afternoon, everyone. I prefer not to hold the mic. So I have the unfortunate privilege of doing the after lunch presentation 2 days running. It's not my birthday today, so I don't know how I'm going to keep you awake. I'm talking about competition versus regulation in power markets, striking the right balance. First of all, I think I better profess I'm not a lawyer, but I have some very good friends who are lawyers, and I have worked with a lot of lawyers. I'm an engineer who knows a little bit about finance and economics. I have worked in the power industry though. I spent my last 30 years working in the power industry in Australia, starting with a vertically integrated state-owned enterprise, then joining a private sector enterprise, both retail, wholesale, distribution, working through the process of structural separation. Then I jumped ship and decided to work for a regulator for a bit. And after all that, I joined the World Bank. So hopefully I can share some insights into how things work. I'd like to be as candid as I can. Some of the games we used to play at both sides of the equation. And hopefully relate to you some of my experiences and some of the things that happen in the Australian power industry. For you, I guess, to decide whether or not it's applicable to Philippines. If there are any lessons, to take those. If there are things that don't work, to avoid them as much as you can. And the way I will structure my presentation is I'll go through sector by sector, wholesale, transmission, distribution, the natural monopolies, and retail from a practitioner's perspective, not so much from a theoretical perspective. The way I've structured the presentation is I'll give you a bit of a background into reform. There are some new people here. I talked about this at length yesterday. Reform in the context of Australian power markets. A little bit of theory on competition and regulation, which I've sort of copied from various textbooks. The rules and the institutional arrangements in the power industry, and then look at some of the examples where monitoring and enforcement action has been taken, so it gives you a feel for who's doing what and who's watching whom. So we'll start off with the reform process. So as I said yesterday, and as it's happened in Philippines as well, the first thing that happened was basically a commitment to the reform process by the governments. In our case, we had a number of state governments and a federal government. In your case, I think you pretty much have one government, maybe some provincial influences. So the commitment to the principles of reform, the necessity for it, the principles, and an agreement to progress in a timely fashion. And that started off with the structural separation of the key areas of the power supply chain: generation, transmission, distribution, and retail. Generators and retailers cannot own or have interest in the natural monopoly segment of the market, and reasonably so, because that's an area that you want to have little you don't want the participants who are subject to competition trying to influence that. The natural monopolies, transmission and distributions, are subject to third-party access on a non-discriminatory basis. Anybody can build a power plant and wheel electricity through the system, and any retailer can purchase electricity from a generator and be able to wheel it through the system to its customers. The whole structure is designed towards fostering competition and regulating where competition is not effective or where it is not possible, such as the natural monopoly sector. So a little bit about competition law and regulation, and it's again in the context of how it works in Australia, and I think it applies generally as well. The thing is, there is a grey area. It's not a hard and fast rule. So in terms of competition law, it generally works on the basis of maintaining an equilibrium in a sector where competition already exists. Regulation, on the other hand, is designed to establish the rules to boost competition and regulate where competition does not exist. I think it was mentioned earlier today, regulation is ex ante. You define what the rules of the game are before you start. Competition, on the other hand, can be a little bit ad hoc. You look at what the behavior of the participants in the market has been, and then you take appropriate action. And competition law applies to broader set of issues, not only sectoral. It covers other industries as well, and the arrangement between electricity and other sectors can be different. As is the case in Australia, where we have a sectoral regulation for electricity, whilst a lot of the transmission regulation is undertaken by the competition regulator, the ACCC. So why do we need regulation? Obviously, in the case of market failure, where the market's not working, there is potential to abuse power. Regulation is necessary. Examples are public goods, natural monopolies. We talked about this at length yesterday, and you're fully aware of this. A high cost of entry, where new competitors can't come and play in the market. Information asymmetries. This is always a perennial problem between the regulator and the regulated. The guys who are getting regulated are often very sophisticated businesses who have all the information. They have the money to buy support and advice. Regulators, on the other hand, struggle a lot of times to try and understand the mechanics of how a business operates, or what the true story behind a business's operations are. And there are various tricks businesses use to be able to extract maximum value out of a regulatory decision. And it's not an easy job on the part of the regulator. On the other hand, from a private sector operator's perspective, they're playing within the rules. They're trying to maximize their profit to their shareholders, which is a legitimate exercise as well. So there's always a tension between the two. And I guess it will remain so as long as that dynamics exists. And I think this is where you need very solid institutions who have the capacity to manage the regulatory side of things. The second area is public interest, health and safety. In the energy sector in particular, prudential requirements, for example, where you have spot markets, you have to maintain the integrity of the market. So you have to establish certain arrangements that ensure that people have confidence in the way the market operates. The special interest, again, coming to electricity example, we talked about subsidies to certain groups of customers because operations are not going to be viable. In Australia in particular, there is a lot of emphasis on the protection of vulnerable customers. Anybody playing in the retail market or anybody operating in the retail market is required to offer arrangements to protect customers who are not able to pay their bills for whatever reason. It might be temporary hardship, there may be pensioners or whatever. And these are areas that need specific sector regulations. And then the transitional arrangements. When you're moving from a vertical integrated, perhaps with some legacy issues of contracts, then there needs to be some sort of a transitional mechanism to move the industry from one state to another. Retail price regulation in our country, and I think in the Philippines, is one example where you need to give comfort to consumers that opening the market up to retail competition is not going to lead to significant price increases and possibly create issues with their abilities to pay. So striking the right balance. I mean, I have structured this in the context of the theme of the forum, which was market power and the exercise of market power. And I guess the whole idea of competition and regulation is to basically prevent the illegitimate acquisition of market power, and more importantly, the exercise of that market power, and to facilitate efficient use of resources. So it can be done through a combination of competition and regulation. Where competition works, let the market sort it out. Where it doesn't, then intervention is clearly necessary. I think what's important from an operator or an investor's perspective is that there is transparency in the way the market operates, the way the rules are made, the way they are changed, and that there is some predictability associated with that, because investors make long-term investments in this market. And if they do not have the comfort that things won't be changed overnight to make them basically bankrupt, then you will not attract investors. And weak participants in the market is in nobody's interest. I mean, the thing is, you need very solid players who make sufficient margins and money, and then they continue to invest in the market. So transparency and predictability are very critical in drawing investment. So what I'll do now is, within those broad principles, I'll go through some of the mechanics of how this has worked in the Australian context. So I'll put back the slide of the institutions that I put up yesterday. So now we have covered up the structure. We have generators and retailers competing in the market. And as I said yesterday, there has been vertical integration between retailers and generators. So the Australian market is now characterized by gentailers. And the reason, briefly, is the physical hedge that you get by owning a generation power plant. So it's a risk management thing from the retailer's perspective. From generators' perspective, they have certainty of market. Rules and institutions is on this slide. The ACCC, the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, which is the equivalent of PCC here, it looks after general competition law. It gets involved in the sector when there are proposals for mergers, any anti-competitive practices. It also is responsible for general consumer protection. Then we have sector-specific regulators. The Australian Energy Market Commission, and this is the organisation I worked for before I mentioned, is the rule maker. It makes the rules that define the basis of participation in wholesale and retail markets. So there are national electricity rules, retail rules. It also sets out the framework within which the natural monopolies will be regulated. And that is applied by the Australian Energy Regulator, which is the economic regulator. It sets the tariffs that the transmission and distribution companies can charge. It also determines the service standards. And then it's also the compliance regulator to make sure that the participants in the market are complying to the national electricity rules and the retail rules. And then finally we have the Australian Energy Market Operator, who is responsible for both clearing the market and the system operation. So it's responsible for the physical side of dispatch and the financial side of market settlement. So let's see how each of these guys, these entities work in each of the different market segments. So wholesale electricity market, it's fully competitive. The contracts are not regulated, bilateral contracts, over-the-counter contracts. But ICCC gets involved when there is a proposal for a merger between, say, a retailer and a generator. And then it also looks at any anti-competitive practices by the participants in the market. The national electricity rules are enforced by the Australian Energy Regulator. It also examines bidding behavior. So if there is any unusual activity in the market, the prices are doing something that's not expected, the AER will investigate that and establish the causes of what happened, and if required, fine the participants who breached the rules. And the Australian Energy Market Operator, of course, they make the original rules, and then if there is a need to amend those rules, they'll go back through a rule change process and fix any holes in it to prevent behavior that's not acceptable in the market. And as I said, AEMO does the market operations part. So these are some of the actions, the ICCC, the PCC equivalent. And these are some of the reviews and decisions that they've taken. IGL, for example, recently wanted to acquire a generator in New South Wales. The ICCC opposed that. They went through a process of evaluating whether or not it will have the effect of lessening competition. If the merits of that merger was acceptable, they did not stop it, but they did extract some commitments out of the company to make sure that it behaved. Similarly, the ICCC investigation into or position on the measure of Synergy and Verve Energy. Synergy is a generator in Western Australia. Verve Energy was the retailer. There were separate entities, both government owned, and they decided to merge because of basically hedging reasons. It wasn't working properly for both. One was losing money and the other was making money. It was owned by the Australian government, and I think the headline there sort of indicates that the regulator was a bit measured in its response to it. They said, we'll allow it, but we'll keep an eye on you guys. And then we have the AER responses in the wholesale market, where it fined one of the players for not following the bid instructions. Basically, they weren't doing what the market operator required them to do, which had an effect on the results in the market. So the AER came and exercised this power and fined them. And similarly, AER also took action on a generator in Queensland for not bidding in good faith. And I think earlier today, I think Dr. Pula mentioned, I think the sense here was that the generator withdrew capacity to influence prices. And then the AER came in and said that wasn't acceptable, and they stuck a fine on them. In addition to that, the AER continuously monitors the market to give confidence to the various players who are involved in the market. I'll throw some slides on some of the key parameters they monitor. And then also, in addition to this, they do take other actions. So the HHI we've looked at, there is some concern or disagreement on whether or not this is an effective measure, but at least it shows you where the market stands, the Australian market, the concentration in the Australian market stands. 0 to 10,000 is the range. 2,000 probably not bad, but I guess again it doesn't tell you fully whether or not someone has the ability to exercise market power. Then you have the residual supply index. This is the measure of the largest retailer's ability to influence market price. So the measure here is whether or not you need the biggest biggest wholesaler to be dispatched to clear the market. Greater than 1 is good, less than 1 is not good. So in this context, you can see that there are the largest retailer has some influence in the outcomes in the market. Whether or not they exercise that power to influence the outcome is another thing. And then another measure is the behavioral indicators. The AER always monitors this. It looks at how the retailers behaved during the market clearing process. The theory here is that if the price goes up, there should be more supply coming onto the market. And as we talked yesterday, up to 100 megawatt hours, $100 per megawatt hour, that theory holds, that as the price goes up, people are putting more capacity in, and which should influence some moderation of price. But once it goes beyond the 100, you can see there is a decline. But this doesn't necessarily mean that someone was trying to influence the price outcomes. It could be because certain constraints bite at that point in time. A generator might be constrained out. There might be a failure, or there is a maintenance outage. So each one needs to be investigated separately and examined for what the behavior of a particular participant in the market was. So going to transmission and distribution, like I said, the AER regulates the prices. The approach that they take is a rate of return mechanism with some performance-based incentives. The revenue requirements are set based on the cost or efficient costs, and they go through a fairly prolonged process of doing that. And the regulatory action is taken within a framework that's set out in the national electricity rules. So the distributors and regulators know how it should work. The funny thing is, though, a lot of the regulatory determinations have been challenged by the regulated entities. Australia had two forms of reviews, limited merits review and a judicial review. Merits review basically says that the complainant says that the regulator got it wrong in some sort of a material aspect in terms of applying the principles of regulation. Judicial review is an error of law. The merits review process was amended to try and limit the number of reviews. It doesn't seem to have stopped, so I think the government currently is looking at getting rid of it altogether. So it'll make it harder for the regulated entities to seek a review. Unlimited merits review gave them time to basically pick out bits of the determination that they didn't like and try and extract a bit more value out of it and leave the ones that they were comfortable with. So again, some of the determinations here, you can see that the Transgrid one is a transmission company. So that's a determination on that operation. The Active AGL is a distribution company. And then the national monopoly, the distributors also have certain obligations. For example, in the retail rules, they're required to provide a certain standard of service for people on life support. And that need to go through a process of making sure that supply is maintained or provide appropriate notice. And in this case here, I think you had a couple of guys fined for not following the rules set out. Finally, the retail market. Again, the reliance here is on the general competition law, where the ACCC gets involved. And again, mergers come in here. So two retail companies merging, there needs to be an assessment of whether or not it's going to lessen competition. and then general consumer protection, and I'll give you some examples of that. IER, the Australian Energy Regulator, enforces compliance with the retail rules and the consumer protection provisions within those rules. And again, the Australian Energy Market Commission, on a continuous basis, reviews those rules and amends them where necessary to strengthen them to make sure that things are working well. Some examples of regulators' interventions. This one retailer, Origin, ordered to pay a large sum of money for misleading consumers about the level of discounts they would receive if they switched to that retailer. This was proven and they got fined for that. And this was done by the competition regulator, the ACCC. Energy Australia is another retailer. Again, it's a gentailer. And it got fined for breaching. I mean, it sort of was involved in unlawful sales tactics. The door-to-door salespeople were misleading consumers and signing them up on the basis of discounts and the service levels they would receive. And this was quite endemic in the Australian industry. The door-to-door people were, I guess, abusing or misleading customers in a big way. So the industry got together and they have agreed not to have door-to-door sales as a sales channel for providing customers anymore. So there's no longer door-to-door sales in the Australian industry. And then the AER was involved in an incident. The retail rules require that you obtain explicit consumer consent before you transfer a consumer from one retailer to another. In this case, one of the retailers got fined because they had not obtained, or on a systemic basis, weren't obtaining the consent before transferring customers. And there's one by ACCC on a proposed merger between AGL and a small retailer. In this case, the ACCC reviewed it and decided that they would not intervene, and that they were satisfied with that. So, in summary, I guess competition is preferred over regulation in terms of maximizing economic efficiency and improving the standard of living. And there is evidence that competition has brought prices down, improved service levels in airlines, for example, telecommunications and other industries. But competition conditions may not always be right for competition. There would be isolated sections where a competitive market cannot be established because the market is too small. There could be areas where competition may not work effectively even if it is in place. So regulation would have to play a role. And I guess continuously you have to balance competition and regulation. And I think what I would favor is that you look at ways of improving competition rather than trying to impose regulation. And again, I mentioned this earlier, you need very competent, well-resourced and independent institutions. Thank you very much.